So we're going to get into airspace today. I'd say it does take a little bit of time because there are quite a few different categories within airspace to get used to, and there's different requirements as far as equipment, and then communication requirements. So before entering certain airspace, who you need to talk to, as well as different weather minimums, entering different types of airspace. Some resource for this one, reading. Hopefully did the correct reading for the lesson. And then the AIM, section 3, is going to talk about airspace, and then charts and legends, which we'll get into Wednesday and then the following Monday. So looking at airspace classifications, when we talk about airspace, that's referring to any portion of the atmosphere above a specific land area, especially above a nation. And so there's going to be two categories, regulatory and non-regulatory. You could further divide that into a few different categories. So we have controlled airspace, which is going to include Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, Delta, and Echo, as well as uncontrolled, something called special use airspace, and other. So you'll notice there's a missing letter on here. There is no class F in the United States. So when it comes to understanding airspace, I just organized it this way so that way you can kind of think about how to, ask questions when you're looking at different types of airspace. So first thing you want to consider is dimensions. So how is the airspace depicted or identified on charts? So what should it look like on a chart? Another one is where does it start and where does it end, referring to altitude. So at what altitude does this airspace start? It could start at the ground. It could start a few thousand feet above the surface. And where does it stop? And then entry requirements, referring to communications. So who do you need to talk to before entering that airspace? Or maybe you don't need to talk to anyone at all. And then equipment requirements. So are you required to have two-way radios? Are you required to have a transponder or ADS-B? And are you required to be certified to enter that airspace? So some airspace, yes, some airspace, no. We'll first take a look at controlled airspace. That's going to include Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, Delta, and Echo. So the reason why we call it controlled is because it's going to be monitored or controlled by ATC. And they're going to provide service within that airspace classification. We're just going to start from the top and work our way down, starting with class Alpha airspace. So you can think A for above because it's kind of above everything else. It's like an umbrella over the entire United States. As far as dimensions, it's not depicted on charts because class Alpha is not at the surface. And so it's going to be starting at 18,000 feet MSL, and it's going to go all the way up to flight level 600, or 600. And what that means is 60,000 feet. So just imagine a canopy over the entire United States, and it extends 12 nautical miles off the coast. And so this covers the entire US from 18,000 feet up to 60,000 feet. And then as far as entry requirements, you need to be instrument rated and equipped to enter this airspace. So as a private pilot, you can't enter class Alpha airspace. Even if you had an airplane that could fly that high, you need to be instrument rated. And like I mentioned before, as far as equipment, you need to be IFR equipped. So that's going to include two-way radios, a transponder, and any required navigational equipment. So if you're relying on a GPS, you'll need that. And again, for a certificate, you need to be instrument rated. So the way this could be brought up to you in like a practical sense is, hey, you just got your private pilot license. Is there any type of airspace you're not allowed to fly into? This would be an example of one of them. Moving down the line, we have class Bravo airspace. So you think B for busy airspace. So class Bravo is going to surround really busy airspace or cities. So metropolitan areas. You could think LAX, JFK, Chicago. So this one, how it's going to be depicted on aeronautical charts is you'll see solid blue lines on your aeronautical charts, and that's telling you the different shelves of this class Bravo airspace. It's not perfectly circular. It could be dependent on the airspace and the requirements. So the shape of it can change depending on which airport it's surrounding in order to tailor instrument approaches for that airport. And the way you can think about it as far as dimensions, most people compare it to an upside down wedding cake. So you can kind of see the shape right here. So it's going to have a surface area in the middle. And then as you get further out from the airport, they don't need that airspace to continue all the way down to the ground, but they do need to protect the airspace above it. And so they'll create layers or segments to that airspace a little bit further out. And those are called shelves. And these shelves will be depicted on your charts with their altitudes here. So I'll zoom in a little bit so you can see better. So because the airspace is, or the lines are blue, the altitudes for this airspace are also depicted in blue. So this particular shelf would start at 8,000 feet and go up to 12,000 feet. Then one of the closer ones, you can see it starts at 7,000 feet, goes up to 12,000 feet. And that's kind of covered by this one right here, but it would say surface. Generally, this goes from surface up to 10,000 feet MSL. And in order to enter this airspace, so let's say your plane is right here and you need to cross over this airspace to get to where you're going. If you're trying to enter this airspace, you need a clearance. So what that means is you need to talk to ATC and hear the words, "You are cleared to enter Class Bravo airspace." If you don't hear that phrase, then you cannot enter. So even if they say Cessna 123, stand by, or stay outside the airspace, you need to stay outside. So what you do is just remain outside, circle, kill a little bit of time until you can get a clearance to enter that airspace. If your route can take you under those shelves, you could do it that way too. You wouldn't need a clearance if you're just going under the shelves, but if you were to enter the airspace at all, you do need a clearance. So looking at the top again right here, it started at 8,000 feet. So if you're planning on transitioning under the shelf at like 6,500 feet, you could do that and you wouldn't need a clearance as you pass through underneath these shelves. So as far as equipment, because you do need a clearance, you need to talk to somebody. So you need two-way radios in order to communicate. You need a transponder with altitude reporting, so that means mode C. And it's a little hard to see, we'll look at this a little bit closer, but there's a magenta circle that surrounds Class Bravo airports. So that would look like this line right here, and you see it says mode C, 30 nautical miles. That's called a mode C veil. So this 30 nautical mile radius surrounds these busy airports, and so if you're operating anywhere within this radius, you need to have ADS-B. Even if you're not intending to enter the Class Bravo airspace, you still need mode C transponder to even be within that area. So for us, the LAX mode C veil does not extend all the way out to John Wayne. It goes pretty close to like Huntington Beach. So if you're doing a practice flight out in Long Beach Harbor, you're not technically in LAX airspace, but you'd still need a mode C transponder within that area. For a certificate, you need to be at least a private pilot. As a student pilot, you can enter Class Bravo airspace, but you need to have a specific endorsement in your logbook from your instructor saying you've had the appropriate training, basically giving you permission to do that. For our students, most of the time we will have you do a cross-country flight through LAX to another airport and back. So at some point you'll get training and an endorsement. And I just wanted to point out too, another thing about the altitude. So you'll also see these really bold blue numbers. That's referring to something else. So when we get into charts on Wednesday, we'll talk about what this number means. But this one is not referring to the airspace, just these ones. Next is Class Charlie. You can think about that as crowded. So not quite as busy as Class Bravo, but generally commercial airspace or commercial airports are going to be Class Charlie. These are going to be depicted as solid magenta lines, like you see here. And this is going to go from the surface up to 4,000 feet AGL. So this one's going to have a couple layers to it as well. So it's going to have something called the inner core or surface area. And this inner core is going to be 5 nautical miles from the airport center. And then it's going to have an outer shell or an outer core, and that's going to go 10 miles from the airport center. And something beyond that, it's not depicted on charts, but 20 miles out from that airport is going to have something called a procedural outer area. And from that, in that area, you need to contact ATC with your intentions to go into that airport.
Sorry, how far out?
20.
From that or in?
From the airport.
Okay.
Yeah, so from the middle. So approach control is going to monitor that area, and you need to contact them before entering this airspace. So the airport could be part-time or it could be full-time. It really just depends on the airport itself. So if the airport closes, at that point it reverts to either Class Echo or Golf. It doesn't stay Class Charlie even after it's closed. And whether it's Class Echo or Class Golf, they will tell you in something called a chart supplement. So if you look up a particular airport, you look at the notes for that airport and it would say, this is the schedule. After that point, it becomes Class Golf or it becomes Class Echo. So for here, the tower closes. If you're trying to land at midnight or after that, technically you're still allowed to land, but it's no longer Class Charlie. It then becomes Class Golf. Now, a little bit more about this one. Entry requirements, you need two-way radio communication with the ATC facility providing radar service prior to entry. So what that means is if you're trying to land at a Class Charlie airport, you don't contact tower directly and say, hey, can I come land? You first need to contact ATC and they will hand you off to the tower. So the tower doesn't want incoming calls constantly because they're just too busy. First, you need to contact ATC, who's monitoring the area that's outside the airspace, and say, hey, I'm going to John Wayne. I have the ATIS information. And they'll sequence you, meaning they'll tell you to go to a certain point, and from there you can enter the traffic pattern. At some point along the way, they'll hand you over to the tower, but it's really just there to manage all the traffic that's outside the airspace. And as far as equipment, since I said you need to talk to somebody, you need two-way radios. You don't need clearance, you just need to establish two-way radio communication. So once they say, Cessna 123, proceed direct to John Wayne or something like that, that is technically two-way communication. You can then enter the airspace. If they stay standby, technically that's two-way communication still, as long as they include your tail number. At that point, you can continue. But if they say stay outside the airspace, you need to listen, stay outside. There's no specific pilot certificate requirement for this airspace. And a pretty rare occurrence, but it does come up on a written test, and you're expected to know, is that in some cases, so right here, you can see the runways right here are blue. And then next to it, there's another airport that's red or magenta. So this is the primary airport, but technically this one is still within the surface area of the main one. So this is something called a satellite airport, and this is non-towered. But in order to operate within Class Charlie, you need to establish two-way communication with somebody. And so if you're leaving this airport, you need to establish two-way communication with the tower as soon as practicable. That's the word they like to use on the test, is practicable. So as soon as you depart, you contact tower and say, just departed Westport. I'll be flying southbound, blah, blah, blah. So it's pretty rare, but it can get asked on the written test what the procedures would be if you're leaving a satellite airport.
What is practical like?
As soon as possible.
Okay.
But practicable implies a little more safety, meaning as soon as possible, like as soon as I'm on the runway or like departing, I can call. But practicable means, once I've reached a safe altitude, once I've completed checklists, then it's practicable. Then we got Class Delta Airport. Think about Delta D for dialogue, because you are still required to have two-way communication in this airspace. So this one will be depicted as dashed blue lines on an aeronautical chart. Typically, this will go from the surface to 2,500 feet AGL, and it's going to have a radius of 4 nautical miles. So from the center of the airport, the boundary right here is going to be 4 nautical miles away from that. And just like the other airspace, it's not always going to be a perfect circle. The shape of it is going to change depending on the surrounding airspace. So it could be a rectangle, it could be a Pac-Man looking thing. You'll notice there's only one number depicted for this one. So the number in brackets is the ceiling of that airspace, because this always goes down to the surface. So since it's assumed it starts at the surface, you don't need to include that altitude with the number. So the number in brackets is just the top or the ceiling. And you can see it two different ways. So right here it says 40, that means 4,000 feet, which is going to be the ceiling. If there's a minus symbol in front of it, that means that airspace goes up to, but not including, 8,000 feet. So the reason for that is because there could be overlying airspace. If you look to the top here, this is referring to the Class Bravo airspace that's overlapping right here. So airspace cannot occupy the same altitude. So they're going to give priority to the class Bravo airspace. So this means that this class Delta goes up to, but it cannot include 8,000 feet. So if you accidentally climb above 8,000 feet without permission or clearance, you'll get in trouble. So make sure you have clearance or you just steer clear of that altitude. Usually give yourself a buffer. Obviously you don't want to be flying at 7,999 just to kind of tempt fate. Give yourself a few hundred feet because things happen. Usually it happens when people are departing an airport and they're distracted with radios, trying to get different things in order, and then they realize that they're still climbing, and so they accidentally bust an airspace. Just like Class Charlie, you need two-way communication to enter. However, you can contact the tower directly. So you can contact tower, say, hey, I'm 5 miles to the south, inbound with ATIS information alpha, full stop landing, or whatever you're requesting, and then they would give you directions from there. And just like Charlie, these airports could still be part-time or full-time. And if it's part-time, the tower closes, it's going to revert to Class Echo or Golf, just like Class Charlie. And this is what it would look like on the chart supplement. So you'd see a note right here. It would say, Class Delta, service from 1400 to 500 Zulu, other times, Class Golf. So this is when the tower is in operation. Other times it becomes Class Golf. And we'll look in a second, but Class Golf is uncontrolled airspace.
In this, we don't need a transponder or anything.
Nope.
In fly over an area where you don't need a transponder, do you just leave it on?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, most modern planes are going to be equipped with radios and transponders, and so we just leave it on. Yeah. Because even when you're operating in maybe like a practice area that doesn't require it, generally we'll still use something called flight following, and so ATC can still see where we're at, and they can give us traffic alerts of other planes. Usually there's going to be smaller airports, but believe it or not, Long Beach Airport is still considered Class Delta because it doesn't meet the service volume required to be Class Charlie, and they kind of want to keep it that way because if they accepted more volume, it would just be more noise for the surrounding city. And then our airport is Class Charlie. We have a lot more volume than they do. All right. I'll warn you now, everything so far are considered the easier ones, even though they are like the busier airports. The rules are just a little more clear. And so next we're going to get into less controlled airspace. However, there are more rules to these because there are going to be a lot more exceptions, and so they can be a little more complicated. If I'm going too fast, let me know. There's going to be a few different ways to find out where this Class Echo starts. Easiest way to think about it is think of Class Echo as everywhere else. It kind of fills in the gaps of airspace that isn't already assigned a airspace. So it's generally going to start at 1,200 feet AGL, but there's going to be some exceptions to that. So one of the first depictions that you'll want to be familiar with is this magenta vignette, is what they call it. So it's kind of a bold, hazy line or vignette. So on the inside of the circle, you can see that the color becomes a little bit lighter. So the inside of the circle, Class Echo, is going to start at 700 feet AGL. Now the outside, or the distinct side of this, Echo starts at 1,200 feet. So again, inside of the circle, or inside of the vignette, Echo starts at 700 feet. Outside of that circle, Echo starts at 1,200 feet. So ask yourself, if it starts at 700 feet, what is below that? It's going to be Class Golf. So Golf would start at the ground and go up to anything that disrupts it.
Inside the circle, it's 1,200, and outside 700.
Opposite. Mm-hmm. So the next one, you'll see it's point number 1 right there, is a magenta dash line. So this is called the Echo surface area. So what this tells you is Echo now goes down to the ground or the surface. So Class Echo is pretty flexible, meaning they can change the altitude depending on the needs of the airport. So in the case of this airport right here, they probably have instrument procedures at this airport, and so they need ATC coverage all the way down to the ground or all the way down to the surface. So within this magenta dash line, Echo goes down to the ground, and then once you exit, so let's say you're departing this airport to the south. So once you reach this point, you're outside of the magenta dash line, but you're still within the magenta vignette. So now echo would start at 700 feet. And then once you go beyond that, echo would start at 1200 feet. So surface, 700, 1200. So in a way, it's kind of mimicking Class Bravo in the way it creates these different shelves or tiers. And then right here on the bottom is very rarely, but you can find a blue vignette. So if you're on the hazy side of the blue vignette or outside of this shape right here, echo is going to start at 1200 feet. So if you were to kind of stitch these two images together, imagine that these airspaces were like next to each other. If I were to put my plane right here where the cursor is, I'm on the distinct side of the magenta, but I'm on the hazy side of the blue. Either way, it's going to start at 1200.
Then it will follow the same inside as 700, or is there something different?
It's different, yeah. Well, I'll show you in the next slide what is going to be inside of this. So for this airspace, no communication is required in Class Echo. All right, a couple other depictions. One is called a blue zipper right here. So you'll see this off the coast, and this is to distinguish different shelves of Class Echo. And then here's another example of the blue vignette and the magenta one that you would see. So if you're operating between these two, echo is going to start at 1200. So it's 1200 on the outside of this blue, 1200 on the outside of the magenta. And then you look down to the bottom, here's another magenta dash line, so that goes down to the surface. And these surface areas, sometimes you can see them attached to different types of airspace. So sometimes you'll see a Delta airport, which I don't think there was one attached to this one. There is. It's a little bit hard to see. So this is Palomar, down by Carlsbad. So the airspace itself is Delta, but you can see there's a magenta dash line right here. So it's like a little attachment that they put onto that airspace. So echo goes down to the surface at that point too. So it extends the airspace a little bit. And I just threw a lot of different rules at you. Any questions so far? Here's a closer look at that blue zipper. So each of these areas would tell you when Class Echo starts. Luckily it's depicted, you don't need to learn a new rule for this one. So here it starts at 1700 feet, 5500, 2700 feet. So it'll tell you. Another look at the surface area. And then here's Class Golf. All right, so here's that image that we just looked at, but now let's look at the inside. So inside, or the distinct side of this blue line, Class Golf is going to start at the ground, and it's going to go up to, but it's not going to include 14,500.
It's from surface up, or?
Yeah. Class Golf starts at the surface and then goes up to, but does not include 14.5. So does anyone remember at what altitude Class Alpha starts at? Yep, so now you have a gap, right? 14.5 up to 18,000 feet. So what fills in that gap? Yep, so that's going to be Class Echo. So then looking at this magenta line, we'll look at it in a different way. So Class Echo starts at 700, that just means that Class Golf is going to be below it. Surface up to, but not including 700 feet. Since the Echo starts at 700 feet, Class Golf cannot include 700. So it's up to, but not including. This one's kind of hard to read. This is showing you, so it's a magenta dashed line within the circle, but everything outside of that is Class Golf. So there's again, I know it's hard to read, but there's a magenta dash line, and then there's a magenta vignette surrounding that. So the area in the middle is not green because that's Echo, and then outside of that vignette is going to be Golf up to 1,200 feet. Just like Echo, no communication is required for Class Golf. So a little bit of the Wild West. Obviously, two-way communication is still encouraged. So whether you're in a practice area or going into an airport, there's still procedures you would follow to be vigilant and stay in contact with other aircraft. So these are called like other depictions. So since we focus on Echo, just kind of think of, if Echo starts at 1,700 or 5,500, that just means that Class Golf is going to be below those altitudes. So same with the vignette. Since Echo starts at 700 here, Class Golf goes up to 700 below it. And then as far as equipment requirements, this is just a nice image that tells you where ADS-B would be required. So within Class Charlie airspace, ADS-B is required. So within the boundaries itself, and even overflying the airport up to 10,000 feet MSL. So if you're overflying John Wayne and you think, well, I'm clear of the airspace, I don't need anything, you still need ADS-B equipment, even if you're overflying that airport. Same with Class Bravo airspace. If you're overflying the airspace and within the Mode C veil, you still need ADS-B. And then Class Echo ADS-B is going to be required 3,000 to 10,000 feet, then 12 nautical miles off the coast, and then 10,000 feet MSL and above within Class Echo, it's going to be required. Only exception with that is if you're within 2,500 feet above ground level or AGL, it's not required. So where would you be 10,000 feet MSL, but less than 2,500 feet, probably in a high terrain environment? So depending on the type of airspace that you're within, there are certain rules to maintain specific visibility and cloud clearance. So you need to be able to see far enough to maintain safe flight and have a certain distance from clouds. So this will be found in 91-155. This is a lot of information. You are expected to memorize this. I'll show you a way that I found very helpful because this is pretty overwhelming. 155. So as a VFR pilot, you need to adhere to this regulation no matter what airspace you're operating within. Starting the top, Class Alpha does not apply because obviously that's IFR only, so there are no weather minimums for Class Alpha. If you're operating within Class Bravo, you need to maintain 3 statute mile visibility and clear of clouds. There's no distance requirement for that one. You just need to not go into a cloud. Pretty easy. And you'll notice some redundancy. So between Class Charlie and Delta, they're the same. 3 statute mile visibility, be at least 1,000 feet above clouds. So if you're overflying a cloud, it needs to be 1,000 feet of distance. 500 feet below, so if you're flying underneath clouds, 500 feet. And then if you're flying next to clouds, 2,000 feet. So that applies to both Charlie and Delta. And of course, just like everything else, Echo and Golf decide to complicate things. So within Class Echo, if you're at or above 10,000 feet, the visibility increases to 5 statute miles. You need to be 1,000 feet above clouds, so same as before, but now it increases to 1,000 feet below and 1 statute mile horizontal distance. So everything increases. If you're less than 10,000 feet, which most of the time you will be, 3 statute mile visibility, 1,000 feet above, 500 feet below, 2,000 feet horizontal. So now this is the same as the others from Charlie and Delta. And good old golf. So golf gets broken down into a few different segments. So this first one, 1,200 feet or less above the surface. So if you're less than 1,200 feet during the day, you just need to have 1 statute mile visibility and to be clear of clouds. So pretty minimal. At night, it increases because obviously you want to maintain even more distance at night when things are a little bit more hazardous. 3 statute mile visibility, 1,000 feet above, 500 feet below, 2,000 feet horizontal. So now if you exceed that 1,200 feet, so you're above 1,200 feet above the surface now, but less than 10,000 during the day, 1 statute mile visibility, 1,000 feet above, 500 feet below, 2,000 feet horizontal. If you're flying at night, the only thing that changes is going to be the visibility. It goes from 1 statute mile to 3. And again, this is going to be the exact same as nighttime below 10,000 feet. Or sorry, below 1,200 feet. So just copy and paste that one. If you're above 1,200 feet but below 10,000 feet, 5 statute miles, above 1,200 feet and above 10,000 feet MSL. It's the same as echo above 10,000 feet. So you got 5 statute miles, 1,000 feet above, 1,000 feet below, 1 statute mile horizontal. Everybody got it?
What's the easy way to read it?
I wouldn't say easy, but this is an easier way. So I'll give you a handout and I'll show you what this all means. There's like a dozen different memory aids available. Rod Machado has one. You'll find a bunch on YouTube. This one is borrowed from a channel called Plain Silly. So I did not come up with this, somebody else did. But I really liked it because it actually made sense to me. So with a memory aid, there's a couple that you could use on your written test. This is helpful because when you go to sit down to take your written test, they'll give you scratch paper. And so you just make a doodle, and any reference to this rule, you can just go back to your doodle, look at what you wrote down, and it's going to be really helpful. So when you go to do your memory aid, alpha, again, doesn't apply because that's only going to be IFR. Class Bravo is pretty simple, 3 statute miles clear of clouds. So the ones that get a little more difficult are going to be echo and golf. And so if you want to practice on the backside of that, it'd probably help you a little bit. But what you do is draw a big E and a big G, kind of block letters, because you can subdivide it. So draw your E and your G. And then I think my animations are a little bit out of order, but just go with it. So then you're going to draw a line through both of those. That's going to be your 10,000 foot MSL. So because class echo and golf are going to be the same at or above 10,000 feet MSL, this applies to both of them. And then the G, you're going to divide that into 4 squares. So this is going to differentiate between day, night, as well as the 1,200 foot rule. There it is, 1,200 feet. Some nice, beautiful clouds. So if you're above 10,000 feet, so we'll get that. Doop, there it is. So whether you're in echo or golf above 10,000 feet, the rule is going to be 5 statute miles, 1,000 feet above, 1,000 feet below, 1 statute mile horizontal. Now if you're below 10,000 feet or within Charlie or Delta, it's all the same, 3 statute miles, 152. So the way you can remember those distances is a Cessna 152. So there's 3 152s, and the order that goes in is alphabetical. I always got them mixed up. I'm like, which one's above, which one's horizontal, which one's blah, blah, blah. So it's pretty easy to remember 152, as long as you can remember it's alphabetical, above, below, horizontal. So 1,000 feet above, 500 feet below, 2,000 feet horizontal. And then we get into golf, which again is a little more complicated, but I think it helps organizing it this way between day, night, and then 1,200 feet. So starting above 1,200 feet during the day, it's 1 statute mile, 152. If you're below 1,200 feet, it goes down to 1 statute mile, clear of clouds. For nighttime, they're the same, 3,152. If you find one that works better for you, feel free to use it. For me, I just like the way this one worked. I wrote it down a couple times, and after that, it was pretty easy. So if the weather, if you cannot maintain these distances or visibility, you cannot go fly legally as a VFR pilot. However, there is one exception, and that's called special VFR. So if any of the distances or visibility is below what we just looked at, you can request something called special VFR. They're not going to give this to you. You have to request it from ATC. This one does have its own minimums, but it's pretty easy. It's 1 statute mile visibility and stay clear of clouds. Like it says right here, you do need an ATC clearance. Like I said, you have to request it. They're not just going to give it to you. During the daytime, you are allowed to do this as a private pilot. If it's nighttime, you have to be instrument rated to request this. So just as a reference, in this picture right here, this is like 6 miles visibility. So it's pretty minimal. Like 1 statute mile is like you could barely see your prop. So I would approach this rule with caution as well. Just because you can request special VFR doesn't mean use that as an excuse to fly in really bad conditions. People can get into trouble doing that, and it's pretty dangerous. So unless you can maintain 1 mile visibility and conditions get better as you proceed, then you can do that. Some people may use this as an excuse, like, oh, it's still within special VFR rules, I can go fly. Usually it's a good way to either enter or depart an airspace where weather conditions are better outside the airspace. Next we have airspeed limitations. This is 91.117. So believe it or not, you do have speed limits in a plane. Nobody's out there with radar checking you, but they do have radar, but not like a car. Yeah, let's go line by line through this. So unless otherwise by the administrator, so ATC, so unless ATC permits it, no person may operate an aircraft below 10,000 feet MSL at an indicated airspeed more than 250 knots. So it says indicated, so that's what your aircraft says, not necessarily what ground speed says. So below 10,000 feet, 250 knots. You could do half of that on a good day in a Cessna, so don't stress. Unless otherwise authorized or required by ATC, no person may operate an aircraft at or below 2,500 feet above the surface within 4 nautical miles of the primary airport of Class Charlie or Delta airspace at an indicated airspeed of more than 200 knots. So below 2,500 feet, within 4 nautical miles of Charlie or Delta airspace, or the airport, 200 knots. Does not apply to Class Bravo. And then paragraph C, no person may operate an aircraft in the airspace underlying a Class Bravo airspace or area designated as a VFR corridor designated through such a Class Bravo airspace area at an indicated airspeed of more than 200 knots. So that's what's depicted on this image right here. So if you're operating below a Bravo shelf or within something called a VFR corridor, your speed limit is 200 knots. So that doesn't apply to the Class Bravo itself, just the airspace underlying it and within the corridors. And lastly, if the minimum safe airspeed for any particular operation is greater than the maximum speed prescribed in the section, the aircraft may be operated at that minimum speed. So if a plane is required to operate at a faster airspeed than any of these rules, they can get that approved. Again, your Cessna is not going to exceed any of these airspeeds, but it'll still come up on the written test and you're expected to know them. All right, special use airspace. There's quite a few of them. Way to remember that is MIC-PRON or MC-PRON, however you want to think about it. That's why there's this goofy image right here, because for some reason somebody made it and it's a prawn flying a plane. We'll break them down individually, but it stands for Military Operations Area, or MOA, Controlled Firing Area, or CFA, Prohibited, Restricted, Alert, Warning, and National Security Areas. So starting with the Military Operations Area, or MOA, that's going to be depicted as these magenta hash lines. So the purpose of a MOA is to separate certain military activities from IFR traffic. So that doesn't necessarily specify VFR traffic. So as a VFR pilot, you technically are allowed to fly within this area, but it's not recommended because there's going to be some dangerous activities. If you are flying IFR, they'll generally reroute you or they can vector you through it. It's really just to be aware of it and to exercise caution. So activities for that one could include air combat tactics, air intercepts, aerobatics, formation flight. So military activities that could be dangerous to you or anybody entering the airspace. Just like other airspace, MOAs and a few others have dimensions, meaning they have altitudes to them, where they start, where they end. And these will be found on aeronautical charts. So when we get into aeronautical charts, I'll show you where to find those. Then controlled firing area, or CFA. And the reason why this one's a question mark is because it's not depicted on charts. So it's usually like things like gunnery, mortars. So the military will contact ATC and they'll say, hey, we're going to set up a CFA around this area, and then it changes. So it's going to be temporary and they may move it for whatever military practices they need to do. And that's why it's not depicted. If they detect anybody entering the area, they'll cease fire. So because it's temporary and they'll cease fire, it's not going to be depicted on your charts. Then prohibited airspace. So it looks similar to the MOA, except now it's blue and it'll say prohibited on it. So it could be established for a few different reasons, but like it says, you are not allowed to enter it because it's prohibited. Then restricted. So color-wise, this looks very similar to the prohibited area, except it'll say R for restricted, followed by a code, so you can distinguish which one it is. So although it's restricted, it's not wholly prohibited, but there are certain restrictions, meaning they're going to have scheduled periods where the airspace is considered active and they don't want people entering it, or it's going to have inactive periods in which they will allow traffic through that area. But usually the number refers to the airspace itself and the letter refers to a shelf. So looking at this one, it says restricted 2503 alpha and delta. So alpha starts at the ground and goes up to, I think, 2,000 feet. And then delta goes from 2,000 to, I believe, 11,000 feet. So you would look at your aeronautical charts to see the dimensions for this airspace, and then you can contact them directly and ask if it's active or inactive. For Camp Pendleton specifically, they ask you to contact ATC, and so you just say, hey, what's the status of 2503 Delta? And they'll say active, inactive, or the way they like to say it is hot or cold. So typically, Bravo and Charlie are always active. They never want people flying within this airspace. Delta is going to be inactive a lot of times. So a lot of times they'll permit you to fly along the coast over the 5. You know, if you're transitioning to that area, you just need to check with them. Then alert areas, so those are depicted on charts, just to alert you of a lot of training aircraft. So there's going to be doing a lot of climbs, descents, maneuvers, and it's just to be vigilant. So most of these airspaces are going to be out in the desert. So if you're going through, I mean, if you're out toward like Victorville or like Apple Valley, or you're going to like Nevada and stuff, it's going to be riddled with restricted, prohibited alert areas. So it gives you a nice challenge. So sometimes you'll have to plan a flight around certain airspace, or at least know the rules if you want to transition through other types of special use airspace. Here's a warning area. So these are going to be offshore, and it's going to tell you about areas that are going to be participating, or they're going to be hazardous to non-participating aircraft. So it could be over domestic or international waters. So if you look on the aeronautical chart past like Catalina and stuff, you'll see it a bunch of warning areas. And you want to pay close attention because it could change. So even though this area up here looks similar to the warning area, it could be considered a restricted area or it could be prohibited. So even though they may look similar, you want to pay attention to which airspace is which. Then national security areas. So in this case, it's a magenta dash line. So it's a little bit thicker than the one we looked at for class Echo. And it's usually to protect ground facilities. So if there's something on the ground that they need to protect, they will generally ask people to avoid these areas. And then it'll come with a note. So right here it says, notice, for reasons of national security, pilots are requested to avoid flight at and below 5,000 feet AGL in this area. So you just want to go around it or be above that altitude. Not necessarily airspace, but you'll see military training routes throughout your aeronautical charts, and it's these kind of light gray lines, and it'll say VR on it or IR. So if it says VR, it's a VFR training route. If it's IR, it's an instrument training route. And the numbers after it refer to the altitude. So if no part of that route goes above 1,500 feet AGL, then it's going to have 4 numbers. So like this one has 4 numbers, so this one is going to be below 1,500 feet AGL. If it has 3 numbers, then at least one segment is going to be above 1,500 feet. It's just to raise awareness, like it's impossible to avoid overflying these routes. So just an overview of everything we looked at. So you can just assume anything that's special use airspace or related to military there's going to be military activity that's potentially dangerous for you. There are a few where it gets a little more specific. And so you want to be familiar with all of those and what specific activities could be occurring in that area. If you plan on flying around DC, there are a lot of rules. So you need to be aware of those. So if you're operating within the DC special flight rules area, you need to do special awareness training before going there. You need to file a flight plan, make sure all your equipment's working. So you have two-way communications, transponder. You need to establish two-way communication and maintain it. They're going to give you a squawk code because they want to be in contact and be able to see you. You need to stay outside of the Bravo airspace unless you're authorized to go into that class Bravo airspace, and remain outside of the flight restricted zone, which is the middle. I'll say there's airspace all throughout kind of the outer shelves right here, or the different gates, what they call them. But if you're operating either to this class Bravo airspace or within this center area, then you'll need additional permission. So in order to operate within there, you need a specific active flight plan and to have a TSA waiver. So they're not super easy to get. They obviously don't want everybody flying through there just for fun. If you happen to fly through there, you'll meet some new friends. So expect some fighter jets to surround you. They'll try and get your attention. If they can't get your attention, then they will do what's necessary.
Is this post 2001? Or is it predated that?
I assume after. Yeah. I'm sure it was a little more lax before then.
Do they teach on this, or is this just a like FYI in case you're planning a trip?
The written test, yes.
Okay.
But as far as checkride, I haven't heard of anyone specifically asking about this. If you were to do your flight training in the area, I'm sure they'd be a little more specific about it. I haven't heard of anyone in this area getting asked on a checkride. Okay. But as far as the written test, you will. Or there's a good chance, not you will. Some other airspace. So this is depicting something called a TFR, or temporary flight restriction. A TFR could be created for a lot of different reasons. A lot of those, especially in this area, are for firefighting purposes. So if there's a forest fire and they're trying to, protect that area because they don't want other planes being looky-loos or flying over it, they'll block it off to everyone else that's not participating. Other ones would be VIPs. So if a politician's in the area, anytime a president or vice president flies into LA, they usually restrict all of the Class Bravo airspace, or at least the Mode C Vail. unless you have specific permission to enter there. Most of the time, they don't prohibit commercial flights from continuing going into like LAX, but for general aviation and training, they keep them all outside. Another really common one is, this is Palm Springs, and we'll take a closer look here. So this is Palm Springs Airport. It's surrounded by a blue dash line. So the airport itself is class Delta, but you can see above that it's kind of highlighted with this black line. So this black line is referring to something called a TRSA or TRSA. So that stands for Terminal Radar Service Area, right here. So the dimensions for this TRSA, since the line is black, will be depicted in black. So you'll see 2,000 feet up to 10,000 feet. Over the airport itself, it says surface to 10,000, and there's a couple different shelves to it. So this is an optional service that you can request. It provides additional radar service to participating aircraft. It's not mandatory, but it can be a high volume area here. This one, however, is a very common question because, we live fairly close to Palm Springs. You could fly through that area. And so a lot of times you will get asked about this airspace on a stage check as well as checkride. And the frequency for this TRSA, or how to contact them, will be in the chart supplement. So you look at the Palm Springs Airport and it'll have the frequency for that airspace. This is just another look at TFR. So depending on the TFR, they'll have different rules for it or different restrictions. So a common one around here is Disneyland. It's considered a permanent temporary flight restriction, which doesn't make sense. But they don't want people overflying an amusement park because people are trying to enjoy their day. They don't want planes flying at 1,500 feet just to look at fireworks and say like, oh, there's my favorite ride. So they typically don't want planes flying over there. However, it's nearly impossible to go from here to Fullerton without going through that airspace. And so if you're in contact with ATC, they'll permit you to go through.